Now let's get into these 3 different steps. The first step is the initial contact. So this is the first time you're really interacting and speaking with someone. The next step is the meeting. So this is where you're having a real established, longer conversation. And then the third step is the presentation step. So this is how you when you share how you can help someone. So regardless of what you sell, I think the most complex and also the simplest of products can go through these 3 steps. So let's drill into each step and talk about what that looks like and what you should accomplish in each step. So if we drill into the initial contact, you might hear me talk about initial contact and you might think, oh yeah, that's a cold call. Sure, it could be a cold call. It could also be a cold email. Again, remember, this is the first time we're interacting with a little bit of back and forth with someone. It could also be meeting someone at a networking event. It could also be an inbound call. Maybe someone was referred to you, or they came across your website and they called you and called your main number, got referred to you, routed to you through a switchboard. It could be an inbound email. Maybe someone sends an email to your company, or someone sends an email to a web inquiry submission form on your website. It could also be a customer interacting with you or your company through a website chat window. It could also be interacting with a prospect over social media. So the point here is you don't need to memorize that. The main thing I want you to kind of digest is that this is the first time you're interacting with someone, and it could be interacting with them in any different way given the different methods or technologies we have today. So in this first interaction, you have a few goals, and it's important to know what these goals are so you don't try to accomplish too much. For example, your goal of the initial contact is not to sell the product. And so you should sort of remove that from your mind. And that could be something new for you to kind of realize or think about if you're in product selling mode, where you're always trying to sell the product or validate a need for what you sell. At this point, you're really only trying to pre-qualify the prospect, which is just to determine, does it even make sense for us to have a conversation? You're not trying to determine, are they the decision maker? Do they have money? It doesn't matter. You're just trying to determine, are they in the general area for needing what you have? And by the way, there's a full module on qualifying the prospect and how to qualify, and we'll talk about that in great detail. But at this point, you're only trying to pre-qualify, so that's just a few soft questions. Then you always want to build interest in what you sell, but you only need to build a little bit of interest, so a little bit of curiosity in what you sell. So you don't need to build interest so that it's at a point where they want to buy what you sell, just enough interest to keep them, basically enough interest so that they agree to move to the next step of your sales process. And the close that in the initial contact is not to close the prospect on validating that they want to buy or need what you sell. The close is closing them on talking in more detail. So that's basically agreeing to have a conversation or scheduling a meeting, setting an appointment. Now the structure for the initial contact is, this is a very short conversation. So it's 2 to 5 minutes. And one of the core concepts of the Smart Sales System was focus more on the prospect and focus more on their interests. So to cater that, we want to focus 80% of the initial contact on the prospect and 20% on you. By the way, this might be something new for the product selling salesperson, which would typically try to spend 80% of the initial contact on them. This is what I sell, this is what I do. By the way, an initial contact cold email that for a product selling salesperson is going to be 80% all about the company and the product. So you want to shift, make it 80% about them, 20% about you. And the best salesperson is the one that asks the best questions. The questions to ask in the initial contact are your pain questions and your current environment questions. So we're going to provide you with a lot of different questions. These are the only questions you need to worry about in this brief 2 to 5 minute meeting. Now, and by the way, I just want to point out, I know 2 to 5 minutes sounds like a short time, and you might think, well, there's a lot of cold calls or networking event or times where I talk to a prospect, maybe even in a chat window where you're interacting longer. And so what happens there is either you're taking too much time in the initial contact, or you're moving to the meeting step at the same time as the initial contact. So we actually refer to that as an instant meeting, and we'll talk about what that is later. You need to be aware when an instant meeting is happening. What I really want you to be aware of is where you're at in the sales process when you're talking to a prospect, so you can know the different questions to ask and what different things to accomplish, and you can control the sales process and control the prospect and the interaction to a greater degree. So let's talk about what the meeting looks like. And basically, there's a few different types of meetings that you can have. It could be your classic appointment. You set an appointment, you go out to someone's office. It could also be an online meeting. You meet virtually. It happens more and more in today's world. It could be meeting someone over coffee, over dinner, over a drink. And like I said, it could be an extended cold call. So you're kind of calling them and you end up talking to them for 20, 30 minutes on the same conversation. Then you're basically flowing into the meeting at the same time. It could also be meeting someone at an event. Maybe you met them at the event and you just end up talking to them for an extended period of time. Now, there are some goals for the meeting that are slightly different. So in the initial contact, we were just pre-qualifying the prospect, which is determining, does it even make sense for us to talk? Now you're going to take that to a deeper degree and you want to qualify the prospect. So this is determining, is this prospect for real? Is this someone that's worth me spending my valuable time with? Again, we'll talk about qualifying in more detail later, but this basically means there's going to be different questions to ask. You also still want to continue to build more interest with the prospect. You're still not trying to get them interested enough to buy from you. You want to get them build interest to another level so that they agree to hearing about the options that you have and seeing your presentation basically. And the close is not to close your product sale, but to close for the presentation. The structure is, it could be anywhere between 10 to 60 minutes. So for your more simple products, the meeting could be a 5 to 10 minute conversation. For your average products, it might be a 20 to 30 minute meeting. For your more complex products or deeper conversations, it might be a 60-minute meeting. The level of attention in terms of how that's divided in the meeting, so at the initial contact, it was more on the prospect, less on you. Now it evens out. So it's 50% on the prospect, 50% on you. In a 30-minute meeting, what that might look like is you spend the first 15 minutes on the prospect, and you do that by asking questions. And then in ideal scenarios, you ask questions and learn about them, and then you spend the remainder, the second half, the second 15 minutes on about you. So how you match up against what they need, how you can help would be ideal. And the questions to ask, you can go back to your pain questions, any pain or current environment questions you haven't asked so far, but now you can start to add in qualifying questions trying to determine what exactly is going on with the prospect and if they're for real. So once you have done that, then you can move on to the meeting, to the presentation step. And what the presentation can look like is, it can look like a traditional presentation where you're showing a set of slides about your product and company and how you can help. It could be a demonstration of your product or service. Now, I will point out, many salespeople sell something that's very understood or fairly simple, and there's not a need for a formal presentation. No problem. In that case, you still need to go to the presentation step of the sales process, but your presentation step might be more simple, and it could be you sharing and maybe going through a proposal or a quote with the prospect. By the way, this, in a lot of cases, if you don't really worry about these processes, you might be sending over a proposal or a quote to a prospect and just letting them go through that on their own. When you really embrace this process, you might realize that this is the third step of the process, and you should go through the proposal with the prospect. So you can schedule it more as a meeting instead of just sending the document over to them for them to go through it on their own. And for very simple products, the presentation step might be just sharing a list of options. For example, let's say that this is a real life example for me. I had an inspector come out to look to see if I had termites. He did an inspection of my house, And then after the inspection was done, he opened a brochure and said, you can do this, or we could do that, or we could do this. Which one do you want to do? Well, when he showed me that brochure, that was actually the presentation step. So it was a 5-minute conversation, but him going through that and explaining all the different packages was the presentation step. So even if you sell something that's very everyday, very commonly known product or service, you still should or could go through this step. Now the goals are, you might want to continue to qualify if you haven't really fully qualified the prospect in the meeting step. At this point, you want to build interest to a level where the prospect is interested in buying what you sell. So this is your real opportunity to communicate what you have to offer, how you differ, how you can help the prospect, and how you match up against their needs. And your goal is to close the prospect on buying your product or service. Now, I want to point out the goal is to close the prospect on your product. Of course, there are in most situations, there are steps after the presentation. Maybe it's sending over a contract, and maybe there's a redlining or additional meetings, or has to go through a committee. I don't doubt that for a minute, and probably in more cases than not, that is the situation. But at the end of your presentation, you still should or could close for the validation of buying your product, meaning, do we agree to move forward? Even if there are 10 steps, and even the close could even involve agreeing on the 10 steps. Are these the 10 steps that need to happen next? Okay, do we agree that you're interested in moving forward to those steps and moving forward? So you could close for validation, if not close for the actual signature. Now the structure is, the presentation could be anywhere between 30 minutes to 2 hours. Where you land on that might be the complexity in what you sell. And the distribution of attention is the exact opposite of what it is at the initial contact. So the initial contact was more on the prospect and less on you. Now it's less on the prospect, 80% on you. What that might look like is you might spend the first 20% of the meeting, the presentation, on them, saying this is what we've learned about you, and then you're all about you and how you can help. Or it could be the first 10 minutes is your findings and about them, then 80% on you and how you can help, and then the 10% at the end for more questions and discussion about the prospect. Questions, you can still go back to any pain questions, current environment questions you haven't asked, and any qualifying questions you haven't asked. The new set of questions here are your closing questions. So this is where you're really trying to close the prospect on moving forward. So those are the 3 steps of the sales process. And as you can see, the steps are fairly simple. It's 3 steps. You get a little more complex when you try to understand what to do in each step. But when you're aware of where you are, it greatly improves your ability to figure out what you need to do next, what you need to ask, and again, how you respond to objections and whatnot.